a counsellor, but also a counsellor. So I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. Can people see that? Can somebody yeah, Liz, thanks. Right. Okay, so I'm trying to do a slideshow. Here we go. Right. Oh, can people see? Can't see the main. I don't know why it's gone to the other screen. Hang on, I'm going to try and bring it on. Okay. Slide. Sorry, I'm just trying to bring it onto the main screen because I think what you can see is the kind of preview as opposed to the main screen. So I'm going to just try and see if I can move it. No, it won't let me do that. That's a shame. Okay, I'm sorry, I just don't know how to make it go to the main. I've got a monitor as well, you see, so it's not. I was hoping
we can see the main slide, Kindy. We can also see the next slide, but that's okay.
Okay, my apologies. I didn't want you to see the next slide, but it's the way it is now. Okay, thanks, Marianne. Okay, I'm gonna spend the next 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes talking about the intersectional data and how our experiences of using intersectional data from some pieces of research that we did. But before I do that, as this is I guess a women's organisation, women's budget group, I just want to spend a few minutes just saying what a privilege it is to be on this seminar, on this workshop today, and to be working with Women's Budget Group, and particularly Marianne Stevenson. I've known her for over 10 years now. We've done lots of work together, and it's always a pleasure when she asked me to work with her. And it's a shame that I don't get to work with her more often than I did. But as someone who has a lot of respect and credibility within the women's sector and outside, I just wanted to say thanks for all the work that you're doing, Marianne, and within the budget group. But I also wanted to extend my thanks to Liz as well. I know Liz through the Fabian Women's Network, and she does do a lot in the background to keep Fabian Women's Network going, constantly messaging us, constantly sending us emails, reminding us to input this, that, the other, and she is the backbone of Fabian Women's Network. So just wanted to spend a couple of minutes saying that. So on to the actual workshop. So this is a picture really of a piece of research that Marianne and I did called Layers of Inequality. It was looking at the impact of the cuts on Black and minority ethnic women in Coventry. And we did it about 10, 12 years ago now. I'm going to use the term Black and minority ethnic because that's what we used in the research. So why did we do this research? Well, we wanted to show what was happening on the ground, what was happening to women, which women were being affected by the cuts, how many women, and in what ways, which particular services were actually impacting on women's lives and on women's families' lives. And I put this slide in because I wanted to give you some context about where we started when we did this research. And these are some of the things that we knew about women and in respect to poverty, in respect to the benefits that they were receiving, the fact that the majority of women tend to work in the public sector, and something about the quality of our lives, the quality of our healthy lives or ill health. So that's kind of the foreground, if you like, of where we started. So why were we interested in gathering the intersectional data? Well, we wanted to inform, I've put lobbying here, I'll say inform national and local organisations, the government, we wanted to have the evidence, both the quantitative evidence, but also the qualitative evidence. We wanted to show where there were areas to mitigate some of the impact and demonstrate how, by looking at all of the areas that we did, whether it was education, whether it was legal aid, whether it was domestic violence, violence against women and girls, whether it was social care, education, the same group of people, women, were being hit again and again and again. And nobody was really looking at it at that time. And the other thing was to support other organisations to produce evidence for funding applications and for their ability to lobby too. So it was very much from an ethos, if you like, of what can we do to support other organisations within the voluntary sector and the public sector. So we also we're very mindful of some of the key messages that were going out, that we had to have the cuts, or that we were all in it together, and we still are, because we are going to face austerity too. And also some of the media messages and from government about those who actually deserve to have the benefits and those who don't work hard, for example. So we wanted to counter some of those messages and really evidence what's happening on the ground. I'll put this slide up because it still shocks me to today. I spent a lot of time trying to understand what all the changes were happening, and this is just the benefits. This is just the benefits that were happening, because everything was moving into universal credit. There was the benefit cap. So all of these benefits that we were that had been in existence, where were they fitting into these two major benefits that were being introduced at the time? And you can see I had to do this as a set diagram because the only way I could make sense of it. And I had the luxury of being in a warm room at a desk with the technology and with a bit of support from various other people to produce this diagram to make sense. And it really brought home to me at that time how, if you're worried about putting food on the table, if you've got mental health issues, if you are worried about what DWP are going to sanction your benefits, then you're not going to work this out. Just not going to work this out. So this really brought it home to me, and also the need for intersectional data. So I've put this slide in as an example of why we needed intersectional data. So I looked at the benefit cap, and I found through the DWP's own data that the people most likely to be affected were lone parents and larger families. And then I found this huge statistic that of the households that were being impacted, 40% had somebody from an ethnic minority background in that household. And this was when the benefit cap was first being introduced, when I think it was £25,000, if I've got that right. So I don't know what the statistics are now, but it does demonstrate, if you think of people from an ethnic minority background as part of the census. Again, I don't know the latest census, but let's say we're 15% of the total population. But to be 40% of the households are impacted by the benefit cap just goes to show how organisations are different demographic groups are impacted. But this says ethnic minority, right? So what does that mean for the different demographic groups? I never got to find that out. Also, incidentally, this statistic was taken off the website. Luckily, I'd screenshotted it before that had happened. So it's really important to grab the data as soon as you see it, because you don't know what's going to happen. I also wanted to show you this. So that's the benefit cap. This is the unemployment. So here it says that over this period of time, this is what the statistics were for those who were white British women and others who were deemed to be Black and minority ethnic women. So you can see from that the percentage is for BME women is double that of white women. But what does that actually mean? What does that mean for the different demographic groups? How are we going to understand what's being impacted for those of Indian heritage, for example, or those who of Chinese heritage, for example. So I'll show you this next slide. So we did some closer inspection, and there was something what was called a work program at the time. The work program was all about getting people back into work, getting people the support they needed to get back into work. And at that time, when I looked at it, it had been going for about 15 months. So I have the data for the first 15 months. And this is what I found. So this is in Coventry. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to let you read the data. So how shocking is that? How shocking is it that from all other ethnic groups, I mean, all of the statistics are shocking, they couldn't find jobs for women? And I know Mary Ann and I went presented, I think, to a panel about 9 months later, and we found some further statistics about who was benefiting from the support, and those with language barriers were not being included, because the contractor at the time felt, well, what we gleaned from it was that if you had a language barrier, then it was harder. You needed more input, more effort in terms of service provision. So this is a real example of why we need this intersectional data, because otherwise we don't find out who is getting a service, the quality of service, and more importantly, who is not getting the service. So I just get my cursor. I've put this statistic in as well, because we don't often talk about funding. We don't talk about who gets the funding and who doesn't. And again, this is particularly voluntary organisation. And at that time, I think it was 70% of all Black and minority ethnic refugees had lost funding at that time. But I've put this in to say the picture in terms of how little funding different demographics of organisations get as well. So it's not just the service users, it's the organisations too. So this is some of the challenges that I faced. So I've shown you some of the data, and it took a lot of effort. It took a lot of effort. I remember Mary Ann saying, when she did some previous research where she went through the data, you could find women, you could find the age, but when I came, and she carried off, she went. But for me, I had to, what I was struggling with was, often there was data on women and men, and often on age, but not on the breakdown of what the women categories were, so what the ethnic categories were for women. And I really struggled with finding the data. And what that meant was there was a huge data sets, and I don't have a background in quantitative methods, and I found it really daunting. I found it very daunting being faced with these huge data sets. I work in a university, and we have a person who can manage those data sets for us. But if you're a small organisation, and particularly at that time as an independent researcher, it's a huge barrier to getting the data to evidence what you need to evidence or not. Locating the actual data, I remember ringing Mary Ann. I still remember it vividly. I spent the whole day trying to access data that was broken down into different demographic groups. And I went to one organisation who said, oh, no, we don't do that. But if you go to such and such an organisation, they'll be able to help you. So of course I did. You get a phone number. Quite often that isn't the right phone number, or it's a kind of a main switchboard number, and then you have to find the individual or team within that organisation. And once I did that, I was then referred again. I spent the whole day on the phone going to different organisations who were referring me on, and I ended up with the first organisation that I'd contacted in the morning. I was beside myself. I was livid, and I remember ringing Mary Ann to offload some of that frustration that I absolutely felt. I was being told that if I wanted the data, that I needed to pay for it. And it just made me realise that when we put in funding bids, for example, together, we don't actually quantify or include the amount of additional effort that is required, not to mention the mental stress of getting that intersectional data. I found that some of that intersectional data was defined differently. So sometimes it just had Black and minority ethnic, sometimes it had ethnic minority, sometimes it broke down to Asian, African, Caribbean and everybody else. Sometimes it broke it down further into mixed heritage, but not the different heritages of who were mixed heritage. And so it was really frustrating trying to marry up when you're trying to compare the data across different service provision, for example, as we were doing the service areas, legal aid, etc., as I mentioned earlier. It was really, really difficult to produce that comparison that gave a legitimate response or evidence to what we were trying to demonstrate. So I guess what I've just talked about is some of the challenges I've faced, but this is why we really need intersectional data. As I've shown with that breakdown of the work programme, it gives a clearer picture who is actually getting the benefit, who is not. It does provide a clear picture in terms of service provision. So within the council, for example, local authority, which demographic groups are getting which services and who's missing out in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of lower socioeconomic groups, in terms of race, etc. And it does inform policy. It's really important that we inform policy and highlight the social inequalities that we have in society and social inequalities that may have come out through policy development. And it's because we don't want anyone to lose out. Everybody deserves the right to have service provision and to have equal access. And so that concludes my presentation. Thanks for listening. I've just put my academic email there and my social media. So thank you. Over to you, Mary-Ann. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Kindy. Can you stop sharing?
I'm trying to stop share. Let's have a look.
Stop sharing.
Yeah, sorry. There you go.
That's great. Thank you. So I found that really helpful because I think it's a really good case study to show, both why this data is important, but also how difficult it can be to find. And one of the things that we were talking about when we were preparing this workshop, because this is one of a series of workshops that Liz has organised for organisations based in London, looking at different types of data sets, is that unlike the others where we were able to say, okay, this is the data and this is how you use it and this is how you can analyse it, actually, when it comes to properly intersectional data, that is data that's broken down by more than one characteristic, often the data just isn't there. So you can get, you will often get data broken down by a number of protected characteristics under the Equality Act. So they'll be broken down by sex or race or disability or age. You also quite often have data by income. With the economic data that we look at, you're less likely to get data broken down by sexuality or gender identity, for example. There's a real shortage of data in both of those areas, although there is new data coming out in the census, which is sort of rolling out at the moment, and that will be really important. But it's often those categories are looked at in isolation, and it's really difficult to get something that combines all of them. And so what I wanted to do was to highlight some of the areas where you might be able to start looking for data and some of the things you might find. So I think you've been sent a handout prior to this event, which I will just put up on the screen now. Those are the questions, which gives you set of a whole load of different data sets. And the one that I wanted to really look at was the equalities data audit from the Office for National Statistics, which I won't take you through clicking on. This is what happens when you click on it. You get the November 2022 edition of the data set, and then you can look at, it produces a nice spreadsheet for you, which is here. And you can see a whole set of different sets of data and lots of information about how it's broken down. And so it tells you what the data shows, it tells you which organization's responsible, it tells you what sort of type of data it is. So administrative data is data that's collected in the delivery of a service. So it's about people using or accessing a service and the data that's recorded about them. Survey data is what it sounds like. It will be a survey of a sample of people that will give you information. So, for example, the Crime Survey England and Wales is survey data, and then there's also police data on recorded crime, which is administrative data. But you can also see here what it tells you when it's published and when it's most available from and what it covers.
Sorry,
but
Marianne, we can still just see the handout on the screen. I think you need to stop screen sharing and reshare if you change windows sometimes.
Sorry.
And for people that want to follow, the handout is now in the chat. There's a link to it in the chat. So
right, I'm sorry about
download that. That's okay. I've come a cropper with that one before.
Yeah. Okay. So then you can see the different types of data. So as I said, lots of different data sets all down here, from kind of abortion data, social care, literacy, annual survey of hours and earnings. This is a real kind of mother lode of data sets. It's incredibly useful, and I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in equalities data. And you'll see here, it tells you for each survey or each data set what protected characteristics data is collected on. And you can see quite quickly, there's often quite good information by sex and age, reasonable on an ethnicity, but gaps, very, very little on sexual orientation, religion and belief, gender reassignment, some on disability, depending on what you're looking at. So you can already see that there's gaps in what's collected. Right, so I'm going to stop sharing now, and then I'm going to look at one of the particular data sets, which I think is worth looking at, which is the Family Resources Survey. And this shows you how much income different households have coming in, depending on their situation. So I will share that screen. Okay. So can you see this? This is data from the Family Resources Survey, in which you can click through from that master spreadsheet that I showed you. And you can see straight away that you can get lots of information, total household income by region in the country. So you can have a look at data from London. You can have household income by ethnic group of head of household. I mean, there's a question about head of household there, but let's put that to one side. Age of head of household. There isn't one on sex. There is one on household type. So if you look here, can you see this new chart that's come up? So the best you can do here is on households with a single adult in them. So one adult households, where you can look at incomes for average an adult male, an adult female, and then adults. Yeah, even there, when once you've got children in the mix, you can't separate out lone mothers and lone fathers, for example. But you can see that there is there is that data available, but it's only by sex of head of household, or only by ethnicity, or only by other groups. And this is the problem that we find. And so really what I wanted to do is flag up what we can do about it. And the first thing that we can do about it is ask for the data. So a lot of these big data sets, if they've got data by, say, for example, race and sex and age and disability, then they do have the ability to combine it. They just haven't done it. Now, it might be because the sample size is too small. Sometimes when you're looking at very small samples, and it was one of the problems we found in Coventry, where we were trying to get breakdowns because, you know, we felt that the broad heading Black and minority ethnic wasn't, I mean, it's useful in some ways. It shows people who have experience of racial discrimination, but actually we know the economic outcomes vary quite significantly for different ethnic groups. But when we were trying to get that data and then trying to get it broken down by other characteristics, sometimes the sample sizes were